of the Spiritual Exploration Project. My name is Harry Serio, and there is a reason why we are here at the DoubleTree, and we want to thank them and thank Craig Poole for giving us this venue for this presentation. Craig Poole, the general manager, has been part of our Spiritual Exploration Project from the beginning. In fact, I had a meeting with him, and that's how it got started. So it came out of a conversation that I had with Craig. And I want to tell you a little bit about the Spiritual Exploration Project. You saw Bruce Postman's great article in the paper yesterday, but in case you missed it, let me just tell you that the Spiritual Exploration Project is based on a recognition that everyone is on a spiritual journey, whether they are part of a particular faith tradition or not. And it is getting to be that many are not part of a particular faith tradition. We learned that a recent survey taken at Albright College indicates about 50% of the students that responded listed that they had no affiliation. And we're seeing this as a result of churches and other places of worship that are diminishing and closing because people are not responding to the traditional faith traditions. So part of our project is to enhance the spiritual life of the community by recognizing that we are all on a common journey and that all of us at one time or another entertain ideas about the mystery of our own existence, of why we are here, and what our purpose in life is all about. So in a sense, we want to address that issue. And our goal is really to work toward the mutual understanding of each other. Reading is a complex area, so is Berks County. We have seen a lot of people from different ethnic backgrounds. We're seeing influx of new migration. Many are refugees, some are immigrants, some are people from other areas of the country. Some are native Berks Countyans who are just looking for a new beginning. And we want to recognize that there are so many different points of community, and we want to try to understand what those common elements of community are, whether it is in terms of spirituality or in terms of who a person is, what their hopes are, what their dreams are. And so we have been meeting now on and off since last summer, and we decided that we would have three initiatives that would start this project. There may be more in the future, but we're going to start with three of them. And one of them is the presentation tonight on interfaith dialogue. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Berks County, and many of you are, will recognize that there is a interfaith dialogue group known as Common Heart, which deals with Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. But we want to recognize that there are so many other traditions in Berks County, and that is the Buddhist and Zen and Hindu and Baha'i and Rastafarian and Wicca and so many others. It would just be a very long list. And we want to be able to communicate and have dialogue with all of these persons. So our interfaith dialogue is really an interfaith expression to all of these different traditions and no tradition. The second initiative is the development of a contemplative community. And when I proposed this, I had the Iona community in Scotland in mind, which practices a kind of a spiritual basic, and they bring people from all over the world and then go out and do peacemaking and justice work. So it's a matter of deep spirituality linked to social work, almost like the Benedictine Ora et Labora, prayer and work. And Paul Clark, who is the chaplain at Albright, has begun with a group that he calls Works of Mercy, Works of Justice. And that group will be meeting tomorrow evening at Patchell Chapel on the campus. If you're interested, let me know and I'll put you in touch. But we also hope to start a Iona-type community as well. And the third initiative is that of storytelling. We will be interviewing persons here at the DoubleTree and also within the community who have come to Berks County to begin a new life, or whether they are immigrants, refugees, or persons just looking to start over. And our project will be based upon the question, who is my neighbor? Because as we learn one another's stories, we also are able to develop and understand who we are. So hearing a person's life journey and what their hopes and aspirations and dreams are, that helps build a community. Storytelling is a basic component of both the contemplative community and the interfaith dialogue, but it's also a separate one. Now, if you are interested in working with this project, and as I say, it's still evolving, still changing. Every time we meet, we go in a slightly different direction, and it may take a while, but we're moving along. And there will be some sign-up sheets here on the table afterwards. Please leave your name and your email address, and if you're interested, there are 3 columns there for interfaith dialogue, contemplative justice and mercy, and storytelling. So put a check mark in whatever column, or all 3 if you're interested, and we'll be in touch. At this point, I would like to introduce to you Isaiah El Marzuki, Steve, who will speak about why this is our initial project, and why we're meeting here today, and why we're developing this concept. So, Steve.
Thank you very much, Harry. And we've been working in Berks County in the past at least 10 years with different denominations and different religions to try to close the gap among each other and try to have better understanding about who we are and what our belief is. So, as Harry mentioned, that we have a common heart, and this is an ongoing dialogue. We have it once a year between the Muslim community in Berks County and the Jewish community, headed by Rabbi Brian Michelson, and the Catholic community headed by Father Philip Rogers. So, and every time we meet, we discuss a certain topic, and we develop the work to go beyond that with our church neighbors. We've been working also with our good neighbors in Shelton with Reverend Dale Davis and Reverend Megan Haskin, and we're doing a lot of good things. It's not only about dialogue, it's about doing something for the community. So we have the clothes drive, we have the food, we have other things that just sit in there and discuss things. And we just finished 5 weeks during Lent time, and was the subject of it. Know your neighbor, or love your neighbor, or know who your neighbor is. And Sister Tahara Akmal represented the Muslim community with Sister Karima Arshi also. So we try as much as possible to really get to know each other. Without the understanding, everybody's afraid. We have to get out our comfort zone to be able to talk despite anything else. In today's subject, I don't want to take much time because I have more important people than myself and more knowledgeable people than myself to talk. So the subject today is violence, and God is not a new subject. To me, this subject starts since human being starts. And I know this because I know in the Quran, and I know in the Torah, and I know in the Bible, that the very thing happened in humanity that Cain and Abel. Cain had killed his brother Abel. This is to us. In the three religions, that's how things start. Cain killed his own brother. So this is violence. So it developed throughout the history of us and became religious violence, became sect violence, became denomination violence, became violence against minorities. And when you say minorities, it comes down to everybody. When you talk about minorities, we Muslims are the minority now. The blacks were minorities. The homosexual are minorities. All this violence, the clinics with abortion, this is the biggest violence going on in our life. So violence and God, we're trying to blame everything on God, blame everything on religion, and we forgot blaming ourselves. Because God did not call for violence. We call for violence. For one reason or the other. Either for a special agenda, or for power, or for greed, or just because for bullying. Like we see that nowadays. So, I don't want to take much of time of this because I have other people to talk, but I just wanted to show that as Muslims in Berks County, we're very happy with everyone. We have an excellent relationship. We build in this relationship every day, and it's getting more and more. And the more people to know us, the more they understand that we are human like everybody else. I always ask people, do you know a Muslim? You have to know someone to be someone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Steve Al-Marzuki is president of the Islamic Center here in Reading, and he is one of the co-chairs, along with another Steve Onsman, who is pastor of Calvary Church, and Dr. Onsman will talk about the program.
I'll be quick. We are so, this idea, I think it started with me, but I think it grew quickly, because I sometimes get things in the mail. This is called Islam, religion of peace or war. Or if I was doing a commercial, I'd say, Islam, religion of peace or war. I mean, it's got this scary looking guy with a gun and fire, and it's put out by some fundamentalist Christian group to, make Muslims look bad. Then I read the paper religiously, because I guess I'm old, and Voices from April 12th has a wonderful series of articles about fear, threats, and terror. And what really struck me was this young junior at the Hill School, young Muslim woman, who said that talk about feeling vulnerable, feeling afraid for being Muslim. And so I think what I thought was that maybe we could talk about our own skeletons from all our traditions. Everybody's got them. And once we can recognize that, then we can move on and have a real discussion, as opposed to where people point fingers at each other. And so the first person came to mind was Dr. Bryan, because of the work she's done with God and violence in the Old Testament and New Testament. And she's very graciously brought printed scripture for those who might have difficulty with the screen. And just raise your hand, I'll bring them around. Dr. Julie O'Brien.
Good afternoon, how are you? I really would like to thank the Spiritual Exploration Project for this invitation. This is such important work that I'm very grateful to be a part of it. And this goal of finding our common goals while being honest about the differences between us is really important to me. So I appreciate that. And I wanted to start by being clear about the voice that I bring this afternoon. This afternoon, I will be speaking primarily as a biblical scholar, one who has been trained in the close study of ancient texts, cultures, and the history of the way in which people have interpreted those texts. I am a Christian, but this afternoon I am not as much speaking for Christianity as about it. The claims that I'm going to make are informed both by my scholarship, but also my participation in and observation of my own faith tradition. But I would like to be clear this afternoon that the claims that I will make are my own. They are not a party line for a particular faith tradition or even a school of scholarship. We live in an age of terror, or perhaps better said, we live in an age in which the potential for terrorism has taken a central role in our perception of reality. It is difficult to go a day, or dare I say even an hour, without a news outlet talking about terrorism, the Brussels attack, the Boston Marathon bombings, or the security level at airports. Driving on I-81 last weekend to see my mother in North Carolina, I passed a lighted announcement sign on the highway that said, "See something? Say something." It felt like it was there to remind me, as if I had forgotten, that the potential for violence is all around me, and it is my job to do the best I can to keep myself and others safe. For many Americans, the last decade has brought a new level of fear, a new sense of vulnerability, and it has brought a stronger sense to some that we must do something in response. We must figure out the cause of terror, of violence, and therefore get rid of it. Make that threat and the fear that it engenders go away. So as the world seeks to explain and thereby contain violence, the role of religion in the role of violence and religion in our sacred text and tradition has drawn even greater attention. Some secularists, primarily in Europe, but increasingly in the growingly secular United States, are claiming that the problem of violence is the problem of religion. That is, that religion itself is the cause of violence. That its demand of obedience to a God whose demands are non-negotiable is the problem. Its tribalism is the problem. And monotheistic religions are often seen as especially prone to this problem because of their conviction that there is only one God and worship of that God is all there is. I know this secular critique of religion very well, not only because I read it, but because, perhaps like some of you, I hear it from my own extended family. While my extended family doesn't claim that I'm violent, they still are convinced that the world would be a much safer and more civil place if no one claimed allegiance to a power that transcends the human social contract. United States and in Europe, the more popular and more disturbing response to the question of what causes violence has been to make violence the problem not of all religions, but of one religion, Islam. In public and private, Islam is subtly and not so subtly characterized as a uniquely violent religion, calling for jihad against non-Muslims and demanding the creation of a worldwide caliphate. Several Republican candidates continue to insist that barring Muslims from immigrating to the United States is the best way to contain violence, and they insist that President Obama, though somehow they never remember to call him President Obama, they claim that he is weak for refusing to name radical Islam. And these charges, in turn, have evoked a whole series of debates about what kind of religion Islam really is, what constitutes true Islam, and which expressions are perversions of Islam. There have been arguments about what the word jihad really means, what the Quran really says. These debates are problematic in so many ways. Clearly, they reflect an ignorance of Islam, of its teachings, and at times they show a calculated anti-Muslim sentiment. But as a biblical scholar working within the Christian tradition, I also see these debates as problematic because they work with a very simplistic understanding of religion and the ways that sacred texts actually function, not only in somebody else's faith, but also in our own. My claim today, in case you fall asleep and wake up and want to know, is that practitioners of any given faith are often unaware of their own interpretive strategies, their assumptions, and the inherent violence of even their most beloved texts. And too often, they attribute to others the problems of violence instead of addressing the challenges embedded in their own tradition. And so it is, in the time that I have this afternoon, I would like to invite us to consider the ways that Christians have avoided talking about the complications of their own tradition and their own sacred texts by actually turning to a discussion of the Christian Bible. To get started with that, it would be important for me to establish that the Christian Bible is distinctively Christian. It is true that the Christian Bible shares much content with Judaism, because all of the books that are in the Jewish Bible are also in the Christian Bible. But the biggest difference, the biggest obvious difference, is that the books that are included in the Jewish Bible are for Christians put in a section called the Old Testament, so that the Old Testament is followed by the New. That leads many Christians to assume that their Old Testament is the same thing as the Jewish Bible. But even that is not the case. If you've ever been to a different religious tradition and tried to find the book of Daniel, or the book of Ruth, or the book of Lamentations, you will have learned in an embarrassing way for yourself that not all books show up in the same order in the Jewish and Christian canons. But even more importantly for us this afternoon is that the way in which the books are ordered, the way in which they're put together, reflects a different understanding of what those books mean. You can see on my right-hand column that the Jewish Bible starts with the primary text, the Torah, the first 5 books, then moves to the prophets, into a collection called the Writings, so that the Jewish Bible reads from Genesis to Chronicles. Whereas the Christian Old Testament, Protestant and Roman Catholic, also begins with Genesis and ends instead with a series of prophetic texts, including the book of Malachi, that lead directly then into the New Testament. Let me say that again. These differences are not just one of going to school differently and getting a different outline structure. They are reflections of the ways that Judaism and Christianity have understood these books and what they mean differently. Clearly, in Christianity, the books of the Old Testament do not stand alone. They point forward. They are prequel to the important stuff, which is the New Testament. And as a scholar primarily of the prophets, I'm very happy to point this out as well, that in the Torah, or in the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, the prophets have been understood as pointing back to Torah, where in Christianity they point forward to Jesus. Now, for the sake of interfaith dialogue, many Christians have come to call this first part of their Bible the Hebrew Bible, or the Jewish Bible, in order to avoid those connotations, those negative connotations of calling it old. But importantly, a simple name change does not obscure the fact that Jews and Christians think about these books differently, and that Christians have organized these books in a way that will privilege the Jesus materials over the pre-Jesus materials. So while it is common in some circles to talk about a shared Judeo-Christian canon, I would say it differently, that what we have in common shows our differences. It is because we share traditions that we can disagree about what they mean. The presence in the Christian canon of a before Jesus and after Jesus canon gives Christians a strategy for making violence not a Christian problem, but a pre-Christian problem. That is, this structure can be a containment strategy for any violence that shows up in these books. It doesn't have to be ours. Perhaps you know what I'm talking about, but if not, I'm a biblical scholar. I had to do some text. I'm sorry, I just had to. There are lots of texts in the Jewish Bible and Christian Old Testament that Christians historically have been bothered with. They show up here. I realized it was a lot of words, and that's what's on the text. But even the gist of it will help you see this. And that is, the first one that folks often point to is the book of Joshua. If you don't know this, in the book of Joshua, the Israelites go into the land of Canaan, and according to many of the passages, God tells those Israelites to utterly obliterate the native inhabitants of the land. I chose an example from Joshua chapter 8, where God explicitly tells Joshua and the Israelites to go kill everyone, men, women, and children. So the last verse probably is enough. So Joshua did not draw back his sword with which he stretched out the sword, did not pull back his hand with which he stretched out the sword until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. I would love to stay this afternoon and let's talk about the book of Joshua, but my purpose for today is to notice that that call for what many people see as genocide is extremely disturbing. The same thing is true as the list builds about what about the Old Testament would cause anybody trouble. There are very many psalms that also call for revenge against the enemies. The one that I hear offered up as the classic example is Psalm 137 that complains and laments the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonian captors. It ends, "O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done for us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock." Oh, and while we're at it, let's add another list. Oh yes, there's the prophets of the Old Testament, not just ones like Nahum, but even Isaiah, that many people claim to love, that is very clear about God's intention to do violence to God's people because of their sin. Because they, the Israelites, have rejected the instruction of the Lord of hosts and have despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them. The mountains quaked, their corpses were like refuse in the street. For all this, his anger has not turned away, and his hand is outstretched still. I can multiply examples, but I have offered these as to give you the sense of what problem is seen to be there that Christians often try to solve with their interpretive strategies. You could probably fill out my next slide about how Christians have responded to this violence. That is exactly what Jesus came to fix. Jesus said, God is love, and turned the other cheek. Jesus was trying to correct all this bad stuff in the Old Testament. That is, Jesus showed a God of love. These texts show a God of anger and wrath. Thank goodness we have Jesus. Other variations have been offered by, there are many different people working on violence, interpretation, and they'll make lists of how people tried to get around the problems. Here are just a few. Well, maybe God has worked differently with different people over time through progressive revelation. Or maybe violence was necessary back then to keep the faith going so that Christianity would have a safe space in which to grow. Or maybe this is just the way ancient people thought about God. Maybe that's not really the way God really is, but it's what they thought God was like. Or, well, don't read it literally, just read it for the message. What I'd like to suggest is that what all these strategies have underneath them, what they all have in common is they make violence a problem of the past. They make violence somebody else's problems. And listening to not only ancient interpreters, but ones that I talk to in modern settings, at churches and in classrooms, I hear this at least once a week. I don't have to worry about this. That's in the Old Testament. Jesus solved this. The New Testament solves the problem of violence. And while it's a really wonderful book in many ways by Eric Seibert, there's a brand new book that kind of takes that approach. That there's many things you can say about the Old Testament, but ultimately, Christianity is the solution to the problem of the violence of earlier texts. I don't know if you're following my logic here. Christianity has a very complicated relationship with its own text. On the one hand, the violence of the Old Testament will be given back to the Old Testament, and it's not claimed as authoritative as the New. And yet, on the other hand, many Christians want to own the parts of the Old Testament that they like and claim its authority. So they claim as their own the stories of creation, the Ten Commandments, the promises of salvation to the prophets, the Psalms, just not the violent ones. Or even some of the sexual regulations from Leviticus, but not the Levitical laws about sacrifice or the mixing of fabrics. These interpretation strategies, I'm arguing, are highly problematic. First of all, they're problematic for interfaith implications of their own. This view of the Old Testament and its violence leads to anti-Judaism. What gets said about ancient Israel too often becomes the description of the modern faith community of Judaism. Because many Christians know so little about Judaism, they assume that modern Jews and ancient Israelites are exactly the same. Many Christians are unaware of how Jewish life and faith was profoundly shaped by the loss of the temple in 70 CE, and how the development of rabbinic Judaism offered a way for Torah to remain relevant in the absence of temple and land. And because Christians know so little about their own canon, about how it is theologically shaped, they struggle to understand why Jews don't read the Bible the way they do, and they attribute all the views of ancient Israel to the modern Jewish faith community. Again, I can't tell you how many times when I've tried to talk about the Old Testament, the question is, well, but how do Jews read that? As if the Jewish reading in the present is necessarily more faithful to the ancient text than other interpretations. I cannot count how many times, I might ask you how many times you've heard it, where someone goes to explain the violence of the Old Testament by conflating the past with the present. I heard it about 2 weeks ago. Well, that's just the way people are in the Middle East. Right? Or it's no wonder that Israelis and Palestinians can't get along. These feuds have been going on as long as the Bible. Are you following my gist? That the violence of the Old Testament gets attributed to them, while the hope and positivity of the Old Testament gets claimed for us. But I would claim that there's an even bigger problem with this strategy of making the violence of the Old Testament an Old Testament problem. And that is that it allows Christians to avoid facing difficult truth about their own sacred text and their own practices. Shall we talk about the violence of the New Testament? There is violence in the New Testament, did you know? The first one that I'll start with is the book of Revelation. I've chosen Revelation 14, in which, as we go down to about verse 17, angels come out with sickles. They come out, they call out, and say, use your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of vine of the earth. So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and the blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for about 200 miles. Oh, that's just the book of Revelation, right? Progressive Christians, when faced with Revelation, say, well, that one doesn't count. Okay, what about Romans? That's not Revelation. Oh, the wrath of God again. So the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For although they knew God, they did not honor him. So God is wrathful because people aren't doing what they're supposed to do. That Romans? Oh, well, that's Paul. That's Paul. That's not Jesus. Do you see this strategy that when faced with text, the canon of what's actually authoritative not Revelation, not Paul. John? Would John matter? The Gospel of John, for all of its beauty, is a highly problematic. Because what it does, unlike any of the other Gospels, is that it repeatedly calls all of Jesus' opponents Jews. Not Jewish leaders, not Pharisees, not scribes, but Jews. In John, Jesus not only calls them Jews, but calls them things like children of the devil. There's a longer quote there, but notice that Jesus and the Jews are having a conversation. They claim to be descendants of Abraham, and he said, no, you're not. Verse 44, you are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth. And he is a liar and the father of lies. And the reason that you don't hear is you are not from God. Maybe I've just cherry-picked a passage, but unfortunately that's not the case. The Jews then disputed amongst themselves, saying, how can this man give us flesh to eat? And he said to them, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. How are you responding right now? It's a little uncomfortable because many Christians love the book of John. And let me ask if you might be thinking this. Well, okay, that's Jesus, but that's not what that really means. I love John. That can't be what John is saying. That's not really what Jesus meant. And this is what often you hear. Well, yeah, it might say that, but that's not really what it meant. Or if you just understood what was going on at that time and place, maybe that's not really what it means. My friends, it has meant that for thousands of years of Christian and Jewish interaction. That kind of thinking has led Christians to put art all over Europe, and some of it's in the United States as well, that sees the synagogue, that's who this woman is on the right, this is the church on the left, as blind and willfully blind, but not only blind, but blinded by the devil. You see her, the snake that's around her eyes? This way of thinking has actually fueled anti-Jewish violence during Holy Week throughout Europe and throughout time. And it's one of the reasons that the Ober Ammigal Passion plays have been pressured to change some of the text, although it still takes a lot of criticism for its betrayal of the Jewish people. Do you find yourself resistant to looking at our own text as potentially fueling violence? And do you find yourself wanting to distance yourself from Christian history, saying, yeah, but that's not us. The Crusades aren't us. Pogroms are not us. The German church is not us. Perhaps you can see where I'm going, that often Christians treat their own text in a way that if anybody were reading their text that way, you would call them hypocrites. So the pattern often develops that I read my religious tradition and its text one way. I recognize that there are options of interpretation and that there are different ways they can be used. Or I can claim, well, yeah, that's what it says, but I know that's not what it really means. I do work around women's issues in the New Testament. When confronted with the fact that Jesus himself did not choose female disciples, didn't seem to overturn a lot of the patriarchy of the day, I usually hear, yes, but Jesus was so much better to women than was the Judaism of his day. Oh, so it's only good in negative comparison, which Jewish feminists have done an excellent job in calling foul and asking you, what do you know about Judaism at the time of Jesus' day? As opposed to just reading the Old Testament. What do you know about Judaism of Jesus' day? Again, my whole point is that often a faith tradition, in this case Christianity, interprets their own text with nuance and option and different ways of looking at them, and insists that other people's texts should only be read in one way with one possible meaning. And so it seems to me that for Christians to see religiously sanctioned violence as a new Muslim problem reflects Christian privilege of not having been on the receiving end of Christian-sanctioned violence, or known the more subtle effects of being understood as an infidel. My purpose this afternoon is not to demean Christianity, or to deny that the Christian message can powerfully be used to support nonviolence and peace. That is what I devote my energy and life to. It is my claim, however, that all texts and all communities have roots in some form of violence, and that all texts, I realize that's a bold claim that my panelists may disagree with, I would claim that all texts can be used, intentionally or not, to perpetuate violence. And that Christians must acknowledge that this is true for us and our sacred texts if we're going to have fruitful dialogue, interfaith dialogue, about violence in our own world. I am convinced that the violent passages of the Christian Bible are not blemishes on an otherwise pure text, that you could just fix that one, and then the Bible would be pure. There is not a pure Bible. The 23rd Psalm, the Gospels, not even the 10 Commandments. Have you ever noticed, I've yet to have a single student who notices it until I tell them, that the 10 Commandments, as portrayed in Exodus, implicitly condone slavery? Look down here. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything else. It doesn't say don't have a slave. It does say that you shouldn't covet somebody else's slave. It actually, the slave shows up twice in the Sabbath commandment. You don't do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave. Isn't it amazing that when we know what we're supposed to read, we don't even notice what all is there? My claim, my hope, is that by recognizing the potential for violence within our own traditions and within our own texts, we can actually start talking more honestly about our own work with nonviolence. So rather than say our texts are good, could we say instead, I refuse to read my sacred text to promote violence? I believe that it is important to claim our own agency as interpreters, to recognize the potential that exists in all faith traditions, and to claim how we choose to read texts and for what purposes. What that means is that maybe the problem is not with the Bible, but it is in the way that we choose to read it. And so I end with a plea. Let's claim the agency we have in interpretation. And let's choose to read our sacred texts in ways that do not promote violence. And let us listen to when others tell us that there is violence in our texts that we cannot see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, the next part of this process is we want to invite our panelists to come forward and take a seat up here, please. And while you're doing that, everybody else who wants to can stand up and stretch and move around. You've been sitting, some of us have been sitting here a long time. So our panelists are Dr. Pickett, who will be from a Pickett perspective, Dr. Forte, who is from a Buddhist perspective, Sister Tahara, Akmal from the Islamic perspective, and at the very last minute we needed to ask Nancy Nalbuck, who is very involved in interfaith work in the community, to step in and pinch it, I think about 3 days ago. And so we were really appreciative of her willingness to come in and be a part of this panel. What we are going to do is we're going to give each one of them up to 10 minutes. They don't have to take the whole 10 minutes, but they can. And I'm going to sit down there and keep track. When we get to 9 minutes, I'll do this. It doesn't mean you're number one, it means you're 1 minute. So that we can spend the rest of our time in a discussion between Dr. Ryan, our panelists, and all of you. We have a microphone for the two of you to share and one for you two to share. And why don't we just start again and ask Dr. Forte to begin.
All right, so where does Buddhism fit into this discussion? It's rather complicated, but I'll try to make some sense of it. First of all, there's many Buddhisms. There's not like just one form of Buddhism. There's different sects of Buddhism throughout the world, in different parts of the world. Buddhism is a world religion, and everywhere it went, there was different cultures accepting Buddhism, creating their own schools of thought, their own texts. So there's literally thousands of canonical texts in Buddhism, almost an entire library if you take all the canonical texts in Buddhism in one room. But we'd have to say, I think that in general, there's at least a perception that Buddhism is a rather non-violent tradition. It tends to have that reputation, there's some at least some good evidence for that. If you're looking at the canonical text, for example. The other issue that we really should consider is the whole issue of theism, generally in terms of Buddhism. Where does theism fit into the tradition? And generally, we do tend to describe Buddhism as non-theistic. Not necessarily atheistic, because if you go to any Buddhist culture, you will find that there are theistic traditions, theistic-based rituals and belief systems. But it's fairly safe to say that although the historical Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, for what we can say about him, was a human being, and there is a clear distinction from earliest traditions of Buddhism, the difference between a Buddha and a god. They have a kind of different kind of identity, right? And you turn to God for certain things. like protection, long life, overcoming diseases, good harvest, many progeny. That's the kinds of things that, at least in the Asian cultures where Buddhism has thrived, that's what the gods were for. And then the Buddhas were really for a different concern, and that was essentially liberation. How to be a free human being. How do you accomplish that? So if you look at a good number of the teachings of Buddhism, many of them certainly express a kind of nonviolence. And you can start with the very first teaching of Buddhism, which is the Four Noble Truths. I'm not going to go into all the detail. But the first truth is the truth of suffering. Right? So really Buddhism begins with that. That is the foundation, right? The truth of suffering. So, in terms of a very simple but basic contrast that you have, the Abrahamic traditions, and Buddhism is the Abrahamic traditions, begin with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Buddhism begins with the truth of suffering, which is, a quite different kind of starting point there. So at the very basis, there is a concern for the problem of suffering, mainly for the suffering of human beings, but it also includes the suffering of animals. And this begins in the precepts, so you have these 5 precepts that you accept as a Buddhist. When you become a Buddhist, you take the 5 precepts, kind of guides, you promise to live according to these. And they're mainly a list of abstentions, not to kill, not to steal, not to, I'm sure some of these sound familiar to you, it's similar to, again, in biblical tradition too, and not to lie, and not to ingest intoxicants, which are, booze and drugs, basically, and not to engage in sexual misconduct, which means different things for different people, according to, whether you're a monk or you're a married person, or a man or a woman. So, just general structure. And if you look at the text, and I'll just give you one example here. In the precepts, there is this, very nonviolent structure to them. So if you read, the first precept, not to kill, it says, abandoning the taking of life, the practitioner abstains from the taking of life. He dwells with his rod laid down, his knife laid down, scrupulous, merciful, compassionate for the welfare of all living beings. This is part of his virtue. And then there's one of the main emphases that you do have in Buddhism is speech. That speech can be violent or hurtful. So there's a whole list of precepts about not engaging in false speech, divisive speech, abusive speech, gossip, right? So if you look at divisive speech, for example, it says what he has heard, abandoning divisive speech, he abstains from divisive speech. What he has heard here, he does not tell there, to break those people apart from these people. What he has heard there, he does not tell here, to break these people apart from what those people there. Thus reconciling those who have broken apart or cementing those who are united. He loves concord, delights in concord, enjoys concord, speaks things that create concord. That too is part of his virtue. Right? There's a text, an early text called the Bloodless Sacrifice, which had to do with the very common practice during the time of Hindu practice of sacrificing animals to the gods. And there you have an example of teaching where, you don't kill these animals, and then there's a discussion about slaves. Not only don't kill the animals, but you don't abuse the slaves, and cause them to fear through the acts of being punished or hit. Letting them to live the way they want to live, or do what they want to do. So there's discussion of slaves, where there's a Monks were not allowed to buy or sell slaves. There was more of an inclusion of low caste practitioners. There are certainly some benefits that were brought to women in terms of Buddhist practice. They could become renunciates, for example, and proper treatment of women. But you will find plenty of misogynistic texts in Buddhism regarding women, because if you're a male renunciate, celibate, then women are a bit of a problem for you generally, because women are the cause of sexual desire, and so there's a certain tension there that you find in the Buddhist text in terms of the relationship between men and women, although women were recognized as renunciates as well. And then you have ideas regarding the sense of self, which is very complicated in Buddhism. We won't get into the details, but the argument is essentially that you don't have an individual self. That's one of the major mistakes that human beings make, is they think they're an individual self. But really what you are is a set of relationships. You are influenced by everything around you. What you become, what you are, and how you understand the world is really based on a very complex network of causes and conditions. So there's really no central ego, and the idea is that you spend your life attempting to protect and fight for that self, so that self is going to get what it wants. And that's a losing proposition. The self never gets everything that it wants. And the self is an illusion from the starting point, so it's a bit of a problem. And yes, 1 minute. Okay, so where it becomes complicated in terms of this idea of nonviolence and problem of suffering is that the main Buddhist argument is that suffering actually comes from states of mind, which means that regardless of what's happening around you in the world, in your life in the world, what causes your suffering is the way that you think and feel about them, not the actual events themselves. So there's always been this tension about what do you do about those things, injustices around you. So Buddhism has come under a great deal of criticism that they just don't care about doing much for the world, right? They're mainly, meditational, renunciate, and there is a great emphasis on that, right? And there are examples from the text that show, no matter what, don't let your mind become angry, even if you're being attacked or someone else is being attacked. Just think loving thoughts towards the attacker so that your mind doesn't become impure from these defiled thoughts of anger and hatred. So, of course, these really develop clear senses of compassion and love, but they're a little bit problematic in terms of responding to social injustices. So what you have now is movements in the 20th century related to socially engaged Buddhism in order to kind of respond to those things. The last thing I would want to just mention very briefly, and then the other issue that we have to recognize is if you look over the last 20 years, there are clear examples of systems of violence that have been perpetrated and promoted in Buddhist cultures. Examples are in Japan and the military buildup. In the early 20th century, much of that military expansion was supported by Buddhists, and there are books about it, Buddhism at Zen at War, for example. And then in Sri Lanka, long civil war between Buddhists and Tamil Hindus. And now, presently, you have in Myanmar some very difficult situation between Buddhists and Muslims in Myanmar, where the majority of Buddhists are, in many ways, mistreating Muslims, segregating them, and they're being recognized as crimes against humanity, and these are occurring right now. So we can certainly find examples of Buddhists have perpetrated violence in the name of Buddhism.
Thank you.
Sorry.
My name is Pickett, and I'm a member of a religion called the Religious Society of Friends. They're called Quakers or Friends. Quakers have a huge diversity of beliefs. A little closer. Quakers have a, is this better? More? Okay. I don't want to yell at you. Quakers don't yell. We have a huge variety and diversity of beliefs, but most Quakers believe something in common, and that is that there is that of God within all people. And our peace testimony comes from that belief. We believe that if there is that of God within all people, then we do not want to commit violence against God in another person. Some Quakers call the inner God an inner light, and others call this spirit, and other people call it inward teacher. There are many terms, inner truth, for what this is, but we do agree that there is a little bit of God within every person, and that informs our holiness testimony. Back in 1651, George Fox, who was an Englishman who founded Quakerism, was offered a commission in the army, and he turned it down, saying, "I lived in the virtue of that life and power that took away the occasion of all wars." And that's what we try to do. Now, pacifism may sound passive, but we look at it as an active process. We actively work for social justice, for equality, so that there is no occasion for it, there's no reason for war. And the way we do that is when I'm in conflict with someone, I sink into my spirit inside, hoping the spirit within me will find and speak to the spirit in the person with whom I am in conflict. So that's how it's done. So how does this play out in real life? Well, most Quakers refuse to bear arms. Many Quakers, some Quakers, fewer Quakers, don't pay war taxes. There are escrow funds that the IRS has that you can pay into, and that money is used for peace. Or some people just simply don't pay the part of their income tax that is designated for war. The women's movement was started, and actually abolition was started by Quakers back in the early 1800s. Lucretia Mott, Sarah Grimke, Angelina Grimke were early Quakers who worked for social justice and equality. Alice Paul in 1917 led the Silent Sentinels, the women who stood six days a week for years in front of the White House, standing silently, requesting the right to vote, and eventually women were given the right to vote. The Quakers support victims of violence too. So in Germany, in Nazi Germany in the 30s, when you were supposed to say Heil Hitler, the Quakers wouldn't do that. They said Grüß Gott, which meant may God greet you, but they went to jail when they did that, when they were caught. When the Nazis required that everyone boycott the Jewish shopkeepers, the Quakers went out of their way to visit the Jewish shopkeepers, visit their Jewish friends in their home. And they said at the time, "We must now put aside our fears. There can be no gap between our religious conviction and our actions. The path of nonviolence is not one of weakness. It demands courage, direction, and the utmost personal sacrifice." At the end of the war, in 1947, the Quakers worldwide were granted were rewarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, as probably most people here know. It was accepted by the British Friends Service Committee and the American Friends Service Committee. Henry Cadbury was the chairman of the board of the American Friends Service Committee at that time, and when he accepted the Nobel Prize on behalf of Quakers worldwide, and this was for 300 years of promoting peace and working to provide relief to, incidentally, all victims of violence. This was every side of a conflict the Quakers supported. He accepted the prize, saying, "You," meaning the Nobel Prize Committee, "are saying here today that common folk, not statesmen nor generals nor great men of affairs, just simple, plain men and women, like a few thousand Quakers and their friends, if they devote themselves to resolute insistence on goodwill in place of force, can do something to build a better, more peaceful world. So Quakers continue to try to build social justice, for instance, being involved in the civil rights eras, I guess I should say centuries. Quakers were very heavily involved in and probably started the Underground Railroad years ago. Bayard Rustin was a Quaker who was a key advisor of Martin Luther King. In the 1980s, the sanctuary movement was the movement that involved people coming here from Central America, not recognized by our government, but the Quakers started an Underground Railroad for these people to help them get to the States. Quakers also build social justice and peace and equality by starting organizations. Quakers were instrumental in starting Oxfam, Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and other organizations. In 1975, Quakers, formally, they were a group of Quakers in New York City, worked within the prison system, setting up the Alternatives to Violence program, teaching alternatives to violence. And now that program has grown beyond what Quakerism can handle, and it is now a separate organization that's active in more than 50 countries around the world. I have 3 friends in Lancaster, New York, who just got back from their 9th trip to Israel and Palestine, working with both sides on teaching them alternatives to violence and healing the scars of violence. And of course, we try to educate ourselves. I'm just this afternoon coming back from the White Privilege Conference in Philadelphia, where we worked on healing racism and even microaggressions and learn how to handle that more effectively. So, in short, the concept of that of God within every person is what makes Quakers promote peace and work for justice, so there's not the need for war.
Can you hear me? Well, first I'd like to thank Gary and thank Steve L. Marzuki and all of you for inviting me here today to speak a little bit about the Islamic tradition and the theme of violence and God. So the Muslim American community is estimated at about 6 million Muslims, and we're a fairly small group here in the U.S. However, we're a vibrant community. We participate in all aspects of American life, including education, politics, social justice, and working for human dignity for all people. And because the Muslim American community is small, I realize that many Americans may not know Muslim or know much about Islam as a faith. So I appreciate today's opportunity to share a little bit about my faith tradition. So just wanted to give you a few statistics first. There's about 1.5 billion Muslims around the world, and only 20% of that population are from the Arab community. There's a misconception that most Muslims are Arabs, and that's not true. The country with the largest Muslim population is Indonesia, followed by Pakistan. The majority of Muslims are Sunni Muslims, meaning they follow the Sunnah or tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, with the other 15% being Shia, Sufis, Ahmadiyas, and other sects. Now, looking at the American Muslim community, we're very diverse. We're one of the most diverse, racially diverse religions in the country. And what that means for us is that someone who says they're Muslim here in the U.S. could have a lot of cultural ties to their practice of Islam. So what you see could be a mix of culture and religion, depending on where the person's from. And just some statistics about U.S. Muslims, the largest population are African Americans, followed by South Asians, and then Arabs here are about 10 to 12%, and then 24% are other. So I speak today as an African American woman raised Muslim in an interfaith home. My mother was Christian and my father was Muslim, and I was raised in Southern California, so that's my cultural context. So many Americans here learn about Islam and Muslims from the media, typically after a terrorist attack. Those depictions and images, which are often accompanied with the Arabic text from the Quran or flags with the Arabic text on them, looping across the television or your computer, it bombards viewers with negative, distorted, scary impressions of the religion and of Muslims. Unfortunately, the minute number of perpetrators of these horrific acts of murder and terror are violent groups representing hate, not Islam. So post 9/11 and more recently post Paris and San Bernardino and Brussels, I'm aware too as a Muslim woman that I am the new face of terror. After San Bernardino, the new face of terror was a Muslim woman and hijab was a mother. So that has been a little bit fearful for me. That's where some of my fear comes from as a Muslim woman. But after these violent attacks, you see on the screen a lot of terms like jihad. Jihad, jihadist, jihadi have been twisted and depicted in the media negatively, giving impressions that one, jihad is a religious duty of Muslims to maintain the religion by any means necessary, mainly through violence. Two, Allah is a God of violence, and Allah simply is the Arabic word for God. And therefore Muslims are inclined to violence. Three, Islam has a dark side, therefore Muslims should be feared and not trusted. And four, Islam is not a religion of peace. And Islam is not compatible with American values and culture. So the word jihad actually does appear in the Quran many times, and it's often an expression that means to strive in the way of God, strive and struggle, referring to the acts of striving in a way of service. Jihad is often translated as holy war, and in the media we see that a lot, and this is incorrect. There isn't any words in the Quran that translate holy war. From an Islamic perspective, the only thing holy is God. Jihad is the human endeavor of striving to improve oneself and to be an asset and contributor to the betterment of society. The root word of jihad is jihada, which is an Arabic word meaning to really exert energy to struggle. And theologically speaking, that means one should strive to develop spiritually, develop a closer relationship with their mind, and to always work on themselves and the community. So the way God is described is not as a violent God in the religion. Actually, there's many attributes of God that are spread throughout the Quran. God is loving, gracious, all-knowing, protector, compassionate. And additionally, every chapter of the Quran begins, all chapters except one, begin in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, as an emphasis and reminder of God's love and humanity. So hate groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda overlook these characteristics of God, and as well as the message of loving others and all people, and instead they take a message of hate. One text that we have that shows how religious diversity is God's design and it's not a place to hate or to impose any other religion is a scripture that says, to each of you we have prescribed a law and a method. Had God willed, he would have made you one nation, united in religion, but he intended to test you in what he's given you. So race to all that is good, for God will return you together and he will inform you over what you're concerned about your difference. There are other verses, and I won't read all of them, that are very beautiful, that would contradict the message of ISIS. One saying, and as a chaplain, this is part of my theological foundation for ministry, and I teach chaplains. There's a verse in the Quran that says that call on God by any name which you choose. God has the most beautiful names. So I don't have attention or a need to want to change someone to be or to think the way I do. And there's others that we follow the scriptures of Abraham and the prophets of the Bible. We look back, as Julie was saying, she talked about the connection between the Judeo-Christian scriptures. For Islam, we're a continuation of those scriptures with the Quran. So we do look back at those scriptures as part of our tradition. A couple others, the reverence and respect we have for Christ and Mary, the commandment that there is no forcing anyone to believe anything, and especially this one, whoever takes one life is as if they wiped out all of humanity. And if you save a life, it's as if you save all humanity. That will go against the violent message of ISIS. So very basically, just some of the 5 foundational principles of our religion are, one, to testify that you do have faith in the God of Abraham, and you believe Muhammad is his messenger, establishing prayer life, the 5 prayers daily and then other prayers, giving charity to the needy. At the end of Ramadan, we are to give 2.5% of our savings to charity for needy families. We make the Hajj to Mecca, the pilgrimage to the house of Abraham, once in a lifetime if we're financially and physically able. And we also fast during the month of Ramadan. All 5 of those things bring us closer in community and to our divine Creator. And if you notice that, this is the bedrock of the Islamic faith. There's nothing in there about propagating the message, bringing people into the faith, anything like that. It's establishing your own relationship with God. Study of verses often used by, I'm going to keep referring to ISIS as the main one. Hate groups like ISIS are taken out of context. I'm sorry. Study of verses often used by hate groups like ISIS in their proper context indicates that the command for the Muslims to fight unbelievers were specific in nature and are not general injunctions and have misconceptions around those verses. Among the most often cited verse is this one that says, kill idolaters. Wherever you find them, and capture them, and blockade them, and watch them at every lookout. That one has come to me so many times, and I think the Muslim community continuously gets that verse about violence and wants to know, what does that mean? I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about that. That's chapter 9, verse 5 from the Quran, the one I just read. So according to Islamic teachings, the Quran was revealed to the Prophet over a 23-year period. The dialogue, so to speak, with the divine came through the angel Gabriel and addressed situations often when they were happening. For example, how Muslims were prescribed to fight and to protect themselves, while other parts offer universal spiritual principles. So to understand that passage 9:5, we must take into account the historical circumstances at the time of the revelation. And just a note about the Quran, there's only about 10% of the text that's about legal injunctions and laws. The other 90% is about spiritual development. So the idolaters, or the Meccan pagans, declared war against Muhammad and his followers. And this was after more than 13 years of his ministry. After about 13 years of ministry, the prophet did get the verse to protect themselves. So war is only to, one, protect lives. There are rules around the engagement. You're to protect synagogues, churches, mosques, anywhere where the name of God is being revered. You protect women, children, frail people. You protect vegetation in the area. So again, the verses that often are associated with Islam and violence was a verse that came 13 years into his ministry to protect themselves. So at that point, when there was, Muslims were being persecuted and harmed because the prophet came back with the same message, monotheism, believing in the same God, which was disrupting the area where he was. And what he did was he realized even before fighting that he could send Muslims to a very fair Christian king for asylum. So that was his first step, to not do anything, send people away, and then to what he needed to protect himself. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here and to share this time with you. I'm going to begin with a short commercial. I am also a member of the Berks Intercultural Alliance, and the Berks Intercultural Alliance is going to be presenting its 8th Faith Festival. Say that fast, on May 17th, and it will be held at the First Unitarian Universalist Church on Franklin Street at 7 p.m. And the theme of this year is Make a Joyful Noise, so of course it will include music, a lot of it. And please put it on your iPod now. And also, it will be on Facebook, and I see the newspaper who's posted this here, and he's been very helpful with telling the public about our faith festivals, for which we're very happy. Now I'm going to do something a bit hokey. This is pass this down. And I'll leave them up here. Please help yourselves on your way out. This, to me, is kind of a visual metaphor. We are confronted now with so many huge problems, so many things that don't work. We have nuclear weapons. We have problems with migration. The terrorism that has been forced upon us really doesn't. What religion promotes violence? That's dumb. We really don't do that. if you take this little tab and pull it, most of the time it will reveal the sweetness within. And to me, this became a metaphor for the small things that we can and do within our communities. I don't work for Hershey. I know Hershey has recently moved out of the country, like so many industries and businesses have, because they can work cheaper out of the country. And where do we go with that as people who care about other people? The people they're going to are other poor people. Most of them, or a lot of them, don't have indoor plumbing or water running. So we have to examine ourselves about that kind of thing too. A small thing and a sweet thing. Sometimes I think we forget that the sweet things are really the kinds of things that we do as believing people, serving in the soup kitchen, helping in a nursing home, all kinds of, we do a lot of things that really work. And pulling the tab on a Hershey Kiss, it works. I just thought that fit into this. Then when Steve talked about the Bible and he pointed out Cain and Abel, well, we just have to admit that violence and discord, thank you so much, Professor, for exonerating really the human community, that we tend to say what we do is okay and what the other guy is not okay. So we're drawn together in doing the kinds of things that really work in the community. I want to hop pretty immediately to Hillel. Oh, getting back to what Steve mentioned about Cain and Abel. We haven't gotten past, I think I wrote it down. It's Genesis 4:17, we've had a murder already. So we know what we're working with. The community really does have a problem with violence and anger and the willingness to take things out on each other. So the need for us to become more understanding is not something we have to think about too much, really. And I see hopeful signs, particularly in something like this kind of thing that we're doing this afternoon. But now I'm going to jump to Hillel, and probably the story is familiar to you about the prophet Hillel. And some smart guy came up and said, can you tell me about Torah and Judaism while you're standing on one foot? And Hillel didn't say, what? Get lost. He said to the fellow, do not do unto another what you don't want done to yourself. And it tickled me. Back in 1996, Family Circle magazine compiled a list from various faiths, starting with the Christian, the Brahma Mahabharata, I'm not going to be saying it right, they're going to be up here, you can pick one up on your way out along with the Hershey Kiss, but here we have something that I think is central to the human family also. Yes, we can be violent, and we have that to work on it, and certainly Professor O'Brien brought that up very clearly. This is something that we all work on, and this is where we're doing it. This is where we're starting to do it, and I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you.
So at this time, we want to have a discussion and include all of you. If you would come up and we could have if the four of you could share a microphone, I could take one and come around maybe. So if we just could pass that one back and forth to each
So
other.
are there questions, comments, arguments? Noel?
Wait. Go ahead.
All
Yes.
No, okay. I have, as a sociology background, I have just always felt that the religions have been used by powers that would like to control the planet, have been used against us, have been used to manipulate the populations of the world, because, of course, there are religions in every society and every culture, so these have been used or misused to manipulate people and to cause wars. And it is not, in my opinion, the real essence of the human being to want to go to war. It has to be instigated, it has to be inspired. And I do believe that the violence that we're seeing is really not inherent so much in the human being as it is stimulated by the media and by the so-called entertainment industry, which work together, the mainstream media, which is controlled by eight groups around the world, one agenda, and then the entertainment industry is also part of the same agenda. So those things, if you look at what is offered to you in the movies, in television, and in theater, anywhere, you can see why people are led to violence. It is suggested, it's promoted, it's meant to be the norm. It's supposedly, we're being brainwashed, is my point. And I think I'm old enough that I can stand back and look at when things were not like this. So I think we need to reevaluate. It is not the religions that are at fault here. The religions are simply being used to promote the violence, and the violence is there for the purpose of profit for those who would control the earth, the world. And fortunately, they are going down now.
Mueller?
Well, maybe, does anybody want to respond to that? You can pull that wireless out and just pass it around.
Media certainly has contributed. Media certainly has contributed.
Yes.
By focusing on violence, definitely.
Nothing else. Okay, we have another speaker.
I don't know, but I can't help but think with all the challenges that young people have with the medications and the drugs and the addictions and mental problems and so forth, that has got to promote more violence, person to person and within families and so forth.
I think it would be nice if you would state your name before you speak, so that we know.
Say your name.
Carol Warner, West Lawn, year and a half. We were formerly New Journey and South 6th Street merged.
Any other comments or questions? Yes.
I agree with the lady in the second row. Violence on television it's tremendous. My husband watches it. I walk away. I don't watch it. There's a lot of violence on television. We got DirecTV. I could not believe all the movies. I'm thinking the terrorists got it from us. All the beheadings and killings and everything that we do in the movies. It's ridiculous.
Good evening. My name is Jamila. I have a question, I believe, for Ms. Lee. In your Quaker tradition, you stated that God is within all of us. Do you believe that we all have the same amount of God in us, or does that vary on, based on
Quakers don't take a position on how much of
Percent today.
But I think the important thing is, are we in touch with God?
You're fine, thank you.
Can we hear God speaking to us, or are we ignoring God? And I think that's the piece of it is, how much nudgings and whisperings. Thank you.
I'm Charlie Curtis from the Temple Unity Church, and our denomination has a theme of nonviolence and seeing race consciousness in everyone. And so I'm just so happy to be in this room with everyone else from all these faiths, and we're talking and we're doing the right thing, and we're counteracting all the media and all the other stuff that's going on, because we're the spiritual leaders and we're the ones that make it happen.
Amen.
Good.
All the way in the back.
I'm Bruce May. I have a question for the whole panel. You're about as diverse a group as we could get. From your individual perspectives, what do each of you perceive as the biggest risk to our world in the next 25 years?
All of you. All.
I didn't hear it, honestly.
What's the biggest risk?
To the world.
I think maybe our being afraid. I was just reading a review of a book that an Egyptian young man has written, and his point, I believe, was that terrorists are people just like you and I are people, and that what they want to do is make us afraid of ourselves. Very often they're young people who think they are going to enhance their position in the world. I don't know. It's a very interesting question. Thank you.
I just want to make sure I understood the question. You said, what is the biggest problem we're facing?
The biggest danger in the next 25 years in the world.
For
Right.
the next 25 years.
I would say maybe watching, well, no, I would say lack of knowledge. I think part of what happens when terrorist attacks happen or things happen that we become fearful and maybe retreat instead of being curious and trying to get information. Like what we're doing now, to learn and to understand one another, I think is great. I think to retreat and to just to form an opinion without knowledge would be something that we should be afraid of.
I think it's inequity. I think that as some of our people are educated and have health care and live in a clean environment, they are contrasted by so many of our people who do not have health care, do not have access to education or a clean environment. And I think that inequity leads to irritations with lack of social justice, and that frustration leads to fear, leads to more violence. And so I guess I would have to say inequity is my biggest fear in the next 25 years.
It's almost impossible to predict because the world is just so complex, and we're constantly surprised by events that we weren't prepared for or we didn't think were possible or could happen. But it looks as though there's a pretty good bit of evidence that climate change is going to be a major issue. And I think the extinction of species, which is happening at an alarming rate, is probably going to continue as well. So I think, at least in terms of predictions, those are the ones I think clearing out.
I would actually combine the last two. I really do think that climate change and what we need for water around the world is so dramatic that the inability to equitably share resources now is only going to be exacerbated in the future. And I do think that by failing to address the real issues of water, is going to, I think, Mad Max is not completely wrong about that.
I think John had.
Thank you. Bob Stewart. What troubles me about the media's coverage of terrorism is the fact that CNN, for instance, will go for weeks covering the Paris attacks. And yet there are other attacks that happen throughout the world that are not covered at all, or perhaps in print, but not by the same extent to that same media. And what we don't understand or recognize is the fact that ISIS is targeting Muslims just as much as they are anyone else.
Right.
And yet we in the West, when we are threatened by a Western event, then equate that with they hate us, but the Muslims are fine, and that's not the case.
I'm Jim Russo. My only claim to fame is that the Pickett is my boy. I'm very proud of that. I feel an obligation to say something in defense of the media. They're in the marketing business. They
Right.
make what people will buy. And they will stop making violent movies when we stop letting our kids go to violent
Watching them.
movies. The media does an enormous amount of good. We wouldn't know anything about what's going on in the world if it weren't for the Red Eagle side. And while I'm babbling, I want to make a plug for Michael Moore's film as an example of the superb role the media does informing us. In the case of that movie, it's called Where to Invade Next. Bad title. It sounds like it's a pro-war movie. What it's about is what we can learn from the rest of the countries around the world. And just one example, he goes to Germany and sets his cameras up in a classroom where the German children are learning about the Nazi era. We don't teach our kids about the Nazi era, let alone the Jim Crow years. So in each case, I think, whether we're talking about teaching or the media, great things are being done an awful lot of the time. Sometimes, yes, of course, they go overboard. We have an obligation to turn to another channel or buy another magazine. Don't just satisfy yourself by saying the media is bad. We're the media's customers.
We have time for just one or two more comments, if there are any. Yes.
I do notice when we talk about well-being, sometimes it is a lot about, it is the media and how we watch it, and that's exactly what he was pointing out, is how we watch it, what we choose. I know my husband and I were with our kids in Canada, and where the sense of well-being is a lot better for many people, especially on violence. And one of the things we noticed when we were watching the news is how positive it was. It was really a positive news, and we loved it. We said, well, no wonder they have good well-being here, if this is the news. And we actually would call the news that we usually watch here in the States, the crime report, the nightly crime report. We actually have found, is it CBS? CBS News out of Philadelphia is very positive, and they say right in their advertising, we changed it to a positive view. You still get the crime report, but you don't get the details. You get, this is what happened, and bam, they're done. And they're on to the good stuff. And I notice when we go to bed, if we watch that at like 11, when you're not supposed to watch the news before you go to bed,
We can still go to bed and rest well and have good dreams because it is, the media does a great job in, they're starting to give us choices.
Last one?
Janice Stewart.
Hi, my name is Amor, and I belong to the Islamic Center of Reading. And I've been here like almost 30 years, okay? And and the reason I've been here for 30 years is because I love it, okay? I love the people, okay? But one thing I would like to ask is, well, first is to thank everybody responsible, for these events, and just to have more, more of these events. And again, thank you. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your participation, and as a very special thanks to our presenter, Dr. Julia O'Brien. And also to our respondents, Dr. Victor Forte, Dr. Pickett, Akmal, and Nancy Noble. Now, if you see me walking around here looking for a sheaf of papers, someone who was at this podium probably picked them up. But I had all of these sign-up sheets for you to put your names down.
Yeah.
So, Steve, did you pick anything up? No? Well, I'll tell you what. If you're interested in the Spiritual Exploration Project, just come up here and we'll put your name down on something. But thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to another presentation.
Can I just say one last thing too? As we said, we got use of this facility for nothing.
That's good, thank you.
DoubleTree, they're wonderful and supportive, and if you can go to their website and find some place to say how great they are, it helps them a lot. We really need to support them. We want them to stay here.
We
want
do.
this place to thrive. And also, great thanks to Bruce Poston, and a great article in the paper the other day, which really put this, was it today? No. Yesterday. I don't know what day it is. But whatever day it was a great article, and you should get on there if you're on social media sharing. Let people know. Thank you.